Okay, we've got about a minute and we're going to get started. Let's go ahead and begin to start to commence. Uh, hope, hope everyone has a sheet. What? More people didn't stay for a riveting talk of United Methodist polity? Wow. Well, thank you so much for doing it because I love talking United Methodist polity. I have chosen to dedicate my life to this particular way of being in the world. So obviously, I think it's good and helpful. It is, again, as I said in my sermon, I don't think that there's one polity that necessarily is more biblical than another. However, there is good theology behind this polity, just as there are behind many different polities. And let me start by just saying what a polity is. It is just shorthand to talk about how the institution of something works. Okay, so every organization, every institution has a polity. Often they're called bylaws. Anyone ever serve like on a nonprofit that has bylaws that you have to follow? Or even my fraternity at Birmingham Southern, I was a Sigma Nu, we had a set of bylaws that told us everything about how we were supposed to conduct business and our ritual and all that kind of stuff. So polity just means that set of instructions about how a group, institution, community will live and interact with each other and the world. So that's very simply what we're talking about today, is we're talking about supporting a community that we can be evangelistic. Because I think one of the things that the United Methodist polity does very well is it creates a situation where we earn the right to tell people about Jesus because we care about people holistically. We want everyone to be whole, body, mind, and spirit. And when you care about someone holistically, they understand that you care about them. They're not a number to you. They're not just a target goal for you, but you care about them. Now, I will say, one of my critiques of the United Methodist Church is that at times we do a really good job of caring about the whole person and then not telling them why. Being so focused on taking care of the person that we forget that one of the reasons we do it because we love them, first off, right? Because we're just told to love. But we also do it because it earns us the right to tell them about Jesus Christ. And that is particular to what we do while we do. There are a lot of humanitarian organizations in the world. There's Red Cross, and there's, and there's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and all these different things. There are a lot of good organizations that try and take care of people, but there's only one, the church, not just the United Methodist Church, but the church that does it because they have the words of eternal life through Jesus Christ. And whatever we do in the world, we need to make sure we are sharing those words as well as all the other things that come along with it. So let's start by talking about how the United Methodist Church is organized. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt or jot them down. I'll come to a point where we can ask questions about the church, the denomination, anything you want to ask. I am not an expert. I might have to tell you I'll get back to you, but I'll write it down and get back to you. Or I might, have an inkling that we can talk about together as well. So first off, the primary unit of organization in the United Methodist Church is the local church. That is the primary unit. So everything else that exists, the district, the conference, the jurisdiction, the general conference, all that stuff we're going to talk about, all that exists to support the ministry of the local church. The local church is the primary unit of the United Methodist Church. It is where we believe the boots are on the ground. In fact, in our discipline, it says that the local church is the hope of the world. Now, obviously, we don't think that because we're so great. We think that because Jesus is so great, and where Jesus gets shared is in the local church. By you, by me, by being in this place. This is why our series right now is called This Is Our City, because we are in a particular place with a particular calling. So the primary unit of the United Methodist Church is the local church, and when we're doing things well and we're doing things right, all the other pieces we're going to talk about exist to support the ministry of the local church in making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Have you ever heard those words before? Those words are in our mission statement as a church, prayerfully making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world by connecting, teaching, and living. That's our church's mission statement. The United Methodist Church's mission statement is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So we're taking our cues from the conference and from the general church, and it tells us what our job is. And everything that they do should be supporting us, the local church, in that mission of making disciples for Jesus Christ. So that's the first and primary unit of the United Methodist Church. Then we have the district. Right now, our districts are undergoing a big change, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this. Historically, our conference, the Alabama-West Florida Conference, it goes from about Clanton down to the Gulf of Mexico. If you were to draw an imaginary line from the Alabama-Georgia border, you just take it all the way down to the Gulf, and so that part of the Panhandle is part of the Alabama-West Florida Conference. So we're this geographic location. Historically, we have had 7 to 8 districts. Each district is comprised of a geographical area. The churches within that geographical area. The Pensacola district that we are a part of has 89 churches. The Montgomery-Opelika district, I believe, is the largest district at 114 churches. So they try and divvy up churches. There is a district superintendent who's a United Methodist elder, which if you didn't know, I'm a United Methodist elder. On my ordination certificate, if I could find it, it says ordained elder in full connection. So that's, we use pastor, reverend, that kind of thing, but my actual ordination is to be an elder in the United Methodist Church. In fact, Gary Hunter in our church asked me one time, he said, "Why don't we have elders in our church?" I said, "You do, you're looking at them." And ever since, Gary's called me Elder Dave. That's fun. But there is then an elder appointed to the district, and that elder is there to help with the running of the churches in that district. That elder is there to help be a pastor to the pastors of their district. So this past week, we get through the worst of the hurricane, and my cell phone rings, and I look down, and it is our district superintendent, Tim Trent. He's calling me just to check up on me and my family. And he wants to know how we are and how he can be praying for me, for my family, and for our church. And is there anything he needs to know that went bad at the church to report back, because there's paperwork for that. There's paperwork for everything. That's another part about being United Methodist, is you don't like trees, I think. There's paperwork for everything. Tim's job as a district superintendent is to be a pastor to the pastors of his district. It is to make sure that we are doing our jobs correctly. There's a reason why we have to fill out forms. It's not because we don't like trees. It is to make sure that we are being effective in our ministry, that we have a level of accountability in our ministries, and so that if we are not being effective, if we have done something wrong, if there is a charge of misconduct towards us, then the district superintendent can be notified. And we have had cases where a pastor has, as humans do, has messed up, has sinned, has done something inappropriate, and the district superintendent has to be called in and brought into that church to help deal with the discipline and the restoration of that pastor, whether in that church, whether removing that pastor. Every situation is different. So you have kind of this first level of accountability in your district superintendent to make sure that the churches are being run the way they're supposed to be run, and making sure that pastors have a pastor, because that's one difficult thing at times is, who's the pastor to the pastor? It's even worse for pastors' families, but that's a whole other talk. You can't be dad, husband, and pastor to someone. So we always have to be looking out for pastors for our families, but that's free. So that's the first level there, above the local church. Then we have, above the district, the annual conference. As I said before, we are members of the Alabama West Florida Conference. Our bishop, that is the elder who has been set apart to preside over an annual conference, is Dr. David Graves. He comes from the Holston Conference, which is a strange little conference made up of pieces of several states up in the corner of Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia. And he comes from that conference where he was a district superintendent and leader of a large church. And his job is to make sure the DSs, the district superintendents, are doing their job. And also, he is the one who has ultimate say on where the elders in a conference go. So the bishop sits around with all of his DSs and he says, okay, district superintendents, who's retiring from a church? Who wants to be moved from a church? What church wants their pastor moved? And they sit down and they come up with the plan for deploying the elders in an annual conference. Good bishops listen to their DSs because the DSs know their areas. I will say that our bishop, I believe, is a good bishop and listens. But ultimately, that bishop has the say. It is not a democracy. It is not it is a one vote system for where the pastors, the elders in the United Methodist Church get to live. And it is up to the bishop. And again, as I said in my sermon, that is one way I believe I submit myself to Christ, is by submitting to the bishop in that process. That bishop is also in charge of helping set the mission and vision for an annual conference, in charge of running the conference office. So, unfortunately, most people in a church don't have much interaction with the conference office. I'll tell you, we have a fantastic conference office. Wonderful people. And if I have a need, let's say I want to know about mission opportunities for our church, I can call the conference office, talk to someone, and they can send me all kinds of information about United Methodist missions, locally, nationwide, and around the world. We have people in our conference office whose job is to be there so they can help churches that are struggling, to find out where God is calling them to, and to help them be what we call the Office of Church Revitalization. We have people looking at the best places to plant churches, where we can be most effective in evangelizing more people in planting churches. We have all the administrative stuff you've got to have. I have health insurance. I'm glad. Thank y'all. It's really helpful. But that means we have to have a health insurance administrator. Her name is Melinda Carnegie, the most wonderful woman in the world. Answers questions, helps us out. And I will say that our annual conference understands that it exists to support the local church. For instance, when COVID hit, Bishop Graves got everyone together and he said, how can we help our local churches? And there are a lot of ideas thrown out about resources and seminars and Zoom meetings and that kind of thing. But finally, someone said, well, Bishop, if you want to really help them, cut their apportionments. And they did. They put out a notice. They said, churches, you are forgiven 1 month of apportionments. For us, that's almost $8,700. 1 month freed up for us. And not only that, you do not have to pay 2 months of your pastor's health insurance. That's not quite that much money, but it's about $2,000 for 2 months of my health insurance. So they looked and they said, we're going to save the churches $10,000. It's costing the annual conference $1.4 million that they're taking straight out of reserves that they have, just for stuff like this, and because they understand that their job is to help the local church. Now, what I have to say in line with our annual conference in our districts is that some of this is changing. In light of what we think is going to happen now with General Conference 2021, we do believe that there's going to be a split in the United Methodist Church of some sort, and that probably our conference will be much smaller by the time that is over. So the bishop has led a process that has actually cut the conference budget in half. We are going down to less district superintendents. Eventually, we will be down to 4 district superintendents. The district offices were combined so that now there are only 2 offices for districts, one in Mobile and one in Montgomery. If you were here for our charge conference where Dr. Trent was here, Tim Trent was here to okay our new leadership, he said, "This is my first charge conference I've ever done not wearing a tie," because he'd been moving his office to Mobile. So the district superintendents we have now are housed either in Mobile or Montgomery. You consolidate that, you save a lot of money in overhead. They're sharing administrative assistants. They're sharing facilities. We're going to decrease the number of districts. We also decreased the number of staff at the conference office, so that budget was cut in half as well. So in September, several members of our conference office were laid off. They are no longer there doing the work that they were doing. All in preparation. It's always better to get ahead of things than behind things. And our bishop has been very, very proactive. I'm very grateful for his leadership. But I want you to know about those changes because as the boots on the ground, we need to know about those. Any questions about the local church district or annual conference? Let's just take a minute there. For some of you, this is review. For others of you, this might be kind of new. Any questions about the way that so far we've talked about our organization? What I'll also say is the vast majority of the money we give to the United Methodist Church through what we call missional giving or apportionments stays in our annual conference. Something like 92%, don't quote me on that, I should have looked it up before I came in here, but over 90% of what we give in apportionments stays in our annual conference. So the vast majority of what we give does not go off to larger things, although it does. There is an amount that goes to support United Methodist Missionaries, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, some of the boards and agencies, those kind of things, but the majority of it stays in our annual conference. Sometimes people think our apportionments is kind of like writing a check and, we don't know where it goes, we don't know what it does. The truth is we benefit greatly from the organization that we support through the giving of our apportionments and missional giving. Any questions? Jane? Yes, that's a great question. Jane asked, does the conference own the property and buildings? So this is something dating all the way back to the first United Methodist preaching house in Bristol, England, that John Wesley, when that preaching house was built, had put into the deed what's called the trust clause. And that clause has it so that the United Methodist Church owns the property of a United Methodist Church. And that in our system is held at the conference level. So our conference technically owns this building and our entire campus. It is held in trust by us, by this congregation. And so this comes up very common when churches want to leave the United Methodist Church, right? They want to leave the United Methodist Church, and our conference will say, okay, that's great, give us your keys, because we own the building, And it causes a lot of consternation sometimes. My great-grandfather built this building. Yes, he did, in trust to the United Methodist Church. And that trust clause has been tried in court numerous times, has held up every time. And they are working on ways to use this, that if there is a split at General Conference 2021, to make sure that trust clause doesn't hamper what you might call an amicable separation, because we don't want to get into a bunch of lawsuits over property. That's not a good witness to the world, right? So, Claire. It depends on what's passed at General Conference. So until something is passed, we don't know. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, but yeah. Someone's got to legislate how that will work before we know. So let's go one more level up, and that is the jurisdictional conference. Jurisdictional conferences are hard to talk about for me. They were a compromise that when the When the Methodist Church and the United Brethren came together, 1968, and that's where our name comes from, by the way. And we are the United Brethren and the Methodist Episcopal Church, putting our names together, United Methodist. There was a lot of fear in certain areas of the nation about who would get to pick their bishops and pastors. And so they created the jurisdictional conferences. We are in the Southeast Jurisdictional Conference. That's basically Mississippi up not to Tennessee and over. So North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, all the conferences in those areas make up the Southeast jurisdiction. And it's within the staff that puts on wonderful seminars and those kind of things. Sorry, our internet is telling me that we have bad quality. Let me just change something real quick here. Maybe that'll help. Those of you watching online, if it gets bad, I apologize. About this time, I think First Baptist must start, and our internet just plummets. Availability plummets. So that's what happens at the jurisdictional level. Now, why this is hard for me to talk about is the reason we elect bishops, the reason jurisdictions were put into place was basically because there were areas of our country who wanted to make sure that they never had a black bishop. They wanted to have say. They didn't want some liberal Yankee or some person out west or someone from somewhere else determining who they had to have as bishop. And so it's really a history, a difficult part of our history. Methodists, we say we're going on to perfection. We haven't attained it yet. But that's at the roots of the jurisdictional conference, and as many things do, that particular function of the jurisdictional conference is obviously not part of what we do anymore. Our conference received one of the first African American bishops, Bishop Morris, and grateful for his ministry. I was in junior high when he came to our conference, and he closed every sermon with a song. Any of y'all ever hear Bishop Morris? Yeah, I love that man. So that's the role of the jurisdiction. Central conferences are any conferences located out of the United States. The African conferences, Filipino conference, German, Eastern European, any conference located out of the United States is called a central conference. Central conferences are given freedom. We have our polity that is contained in the Book of Discipline. If you are a central conference, you are allowed to adapt that Book of Discipline for your context. So if you exist outside of the United States, you're given more freedom to adapt the Book of Discipline. And this is part of the fight the United Methodist Church finds ourselves in even right now. So those are the jurisdictional and central conferences. Then we come to the highest level of the United Methodist Church, the General Conference. This is the only body that can speak for the United Methodist Church. Let me say that again. This is the only body that can speak for the United Methodist Church. I remember, it's painful to bring up, but I remember when I first got out of seminary, Barack Obama had just been elected president, and Nancy Pelosi got up and said, the United Methodist Church has endorsed the Affordable Care Act. Any of y'all remember that? Because my phone rang off the hook. I was in Marianna, Florida, all right? What do you mean the United Methodist Church has endorsed the Affordable Care Act? The United Methodist Church had not. General Conference had not met to endorse the United Methodist Church. Nancy Pelosi found some board of church and society in Massachusetts who endorsed the Affordable Care Act. And then she said the United Methodist Church endorsed it. Don't fall for those things. There are a lot of people who want to just sow division and contradiction and don't understand our polity. Be smarter than that. Y'all are smarter than that. The only body that can speak for the United Methodist Church is the General Conference. The General Conference is supposed to meet once every 4 years. They can have special called conferences, and it is the gathering of people, of delegates from all over the world. Every annual conference from all over the world sends delegates to General Conference. It normally meets here in the United States, although we are planned to meet in Africa in 2024. Is that right? I don't know, it's somewhere out there. We'll see how all that works out. It is a legislative group. It is usually about 850 delegates from all over the world. Somewhere around 22 dozen languages are spoken. The worship is amazing. The organization that goes into it is phenomenal. And we try and do the best to discern God's will together every 4 years. And every 4 years we decide how we're going to be United Methodists in the world. We look at our book of discipline, and we can change it, amend it, take things out, put things in. We love to fiddle around with ordination. In 2000, not this last one, not the special one, but two before that, 2016, at the very last minute, they snuck in this thing where for ordination, you had to do this special project as part of the ordination process. Luckily, I was already ordained. But, it's kind of like, we love to fiddle with things, right? You make these little tweaks here and there. I think they took it out again later. I should know since I serve on the Conference Board of Ordination. But the General Conference meets to talk about those things that affect the whole church. How will we be United Methodists in the world? And they are our legislative branch. So any questions about General Conference, jurisdictional, anything I've talked about so far? Well, I wasn't planning on it. It will depend. So if there is a split in the United Methodist Church, the way I hope it works, now I can't promise this, but the way that I think everyone involved hopes, is that we figure out a way to have an amicable split. And that will basically allow conferences and churches to decide which new denomination they want to go with. So it'll be able to, the way it is right now, it'll start at the conference level where a conference will get to decide. Will we stay with the United Methodist Church? Will we go with the more conservative, newer branch? There could even be newer, more liberal branches. We're not sure. Again, all this is being worked out. But each annual conference will kind of get to decide where do we want to go. And then, if a church disagrees with the decision of its annual conference, then they will be able to select to leave that annual conference and join one of the different new denominations, is the way that it seems to be going. Now, none of this is passed. So I could be eating my words here in the third quarter of 2021 when General Conference happens. But that's hopefully the way that we're going to look at seeing how it goes. And yes, I think a large portion of our church, of our conference, will probably want to be part of a more conservative denomination. So, Renee? Oh, Renee. That's a great question. Different people tell you different things. It comes down to two things as far as I can tell. The first is how we interpret Scripture, and as it is expressed in the hot button issue of LGBTQIA+ issues. So that's the issue is human sexuality. The underlying cause is that different people interpret Scripture differently. And we've gotten to a point where we're not willing to put up with each other's different interpretations. That's about as succinctly, I think, as I can summarize that. If anyone else has a different thought around that, you can tell Renee later. But I think that's fairly... there's all kinds of other things. There are certain churches and people who have wanted out from underneath the United Methodist structure for a long time, and they're taking advantage of it. But I think most people's hearts are good, and they're just trying to do the best they can in following Jesus. Yeah. So in our polity, there are three branches General Conference, we've talked about, that's where legislation comes from. You have the Council of Bishops, that is our executive branch. That is who's supposed to make sure that the discipline is followed, is our bishops. And then you have the Judiciary Council. It is a group of people elected by General Conference who hear issues related to the Book of Discipline. If someone doesn't like something the United Methodist Church is doing, they can have a church trial. And eventually that trial starts at the annual conference level and goes to the jurisdiction and can work its way up all the way through the Judicial Council. Does any of this sound familiar to you? What does it sound like? The federal government, right? It sounds just judicial branch, executive branch, legislative branch. That's because United Methodism and the United States grew up together. We parallel growing up. And for a long, long time, the saying was, as the United Methodist Church goes, so the nation goes. In fact, the United Methodist Church split just 4 years before the Civil War began. Methodist Church South, Methodist Church North. We actually own a prime piece of real estate in Washington, D.C., and the reason we did was because legislators loved to be able to come and get the United Methodist take on things. And we were happy to tell them what we thought. We grew up with our nation, and so a lot of our structures look very, very similar. Any questions about those three branches? Our new secretary for the church council. Sorry, the internet is being bad today. Day-to-day ministry decisions are made at the church council level. We meet every other month. Our next meeting is September 28th, 6 o'clock. And all church council meetings are open, by the way. You don't have to be a member to attend. But that is where the day-to-day ministry decisions of the church are made. So big decisions have to have a charge conference, the election of leadership, the buying and selling of property, building campaigns, capital campaigns, those kind of things have to be okayed at the charge conference level, but the day-to-day ministry can be okayed and discussed, voted on by the church council. So that's how our church is organized, and then into many different committees, of which many of you are members of, ranging from just practical committees like our altar guild, who make sure we have communion and flowers, and the flower committee that takes our flowers. I see you already got Linda. Linda must be flowers this week.